and creativity. The idea being that, is there something about the ethos of a culture that makes it simply more, it's more permissible to think outside the box? And so, as you were describing some of the, think of the words that start with S, it made me think back at the study. So what we did is we ran the study in Taiwan and in Canada, because one of the co-authors was Taiwanese Canadian, and we administered 2 brainstorming tasks to the people, very much like the brick example that you described. One was, if you had a 6th thumb, what would you use it for? The other one was, if you were the tourism director of an underwater city, list ways by which you would try to get people to visit your underwater city. Because these are sort of culturally neutral examples, right? You wouldn't expect that somebody from one culture to know more about those tasks than another. And so what we did is we ran brainstorming sessions in groups of 4. And what we were really trying to test was one cultural trait: individualism versus collectivism. Canadians tend to be more individualist. Taiwanese tend to be more collectivist. And our thinking was that the very nature of the brainstorming task, the methodology of brainstorming, which is, I want to be the guy who thinks outside the box, is something that is more consistent with the individualist ethos, less so with the collectivist ethos. And that's exactly what we found, that the number of ideas that were generated, I think it was in a 5-minute session, were much greater in the case of the individualist. But when it came to the quality of the ideas, as judged by independent raters who were naive to the hypotheses, then the collectivists actually scored higher. So they produced fewer ideas, but their ideas were of slightly better quality. So I think it really fits nicely with some of the stuff that you're talking about.
Did you control for IQ by any chance?
We did not. So you're thinking, all other things equal, the higher the IQ, the more ideas I generate.
Oh, right? There's no doubt about that. Yeah. Like it's a really good thing to any cognitive task. It's almost what would you call it? Mandatory, I would say, to test for IQ, especially verbal IQ in relationship to creativity. Now it may not matter because the IQ differences might have washed out across the groups, but it's almost inevitably of great theoretical and practical interest to assess IQ if you do creativity exercises, because it's a huge contributor.
Are you familiar with the work of Dean Simonton? Do you know who that is?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so maybe you could talk about this, because one of the things that I love about Dean's work is, as a very committed evolutionist, one of the things that I did in several of my books, but most notably in my first book, The Evolutionary Basis of Consumption, is I tried to demonstrate the number of disparate fields and phenomena that one could study in a different way, in a complementary way, in an additional way, by infusing it with an evolutionary lens. And so in the pursuit of that research, I came across the field of Darwinian creativity.
Right, sure.
So maybe you want to talk about this, because I think that's a fantastic book. I love it.
Oh, yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is that, like, the basic idea of Darwinian creativity was put forth most succinctly by Karl Popper, who suggested that the purpose of thinking is so that our ideas can die instead of us. And so, the Popperian notion, and I think it's well substantiated by the relevant neurobiology, is that the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that's responsible, at least in part, for the generation of creative ideas, especially abstract ideas, developed over time as an extension of the motor cortex. So you might say, if you only have a motor cortex, then you only can act things out. But if you have a prefrontal cortex, then you can imagine acting things out in a fictional world. You can evaluate the consequences of acting them out, and then you can decide whether or not going ahead and implementing the action would be a good idea. And that's actually part of what we think of as thinking. Like when a child says to his sister, "You better not do that, or you'll get in trouble with Dad." Basically, what the child has done is constructed a fictional imagistic avatar, run it in a simulated world, evaluated the consequences, and decided that implementing that strategy would be a bad idea, right? And that's what the prefrontal cortex does. And so Popper's notion, which has been shared by a lot of people who've thought about the evolution of thought, is that the typical animal, like a mosquito, let's say, has to produce 1 million different mosquitoes so that one of them gets to survive. Whereas a human being can produce a million different ideas within the same human being, kill off all the bad ones, and then manifest the good ones. And so we've actually figured out how to mimic the process of natural selection fictionally, which is, of course, even what you're doing when you go watch a movie, because what you do is you watch an avatar, a collective avatar, act out a strategy and then evaluate whether the consequences were good or bad. Either way, it's instructive. And so we do that all that. We love doing that.
I would add to Popper maybe a more direct evolutionary link to this topic that we're discussing would be Donald Campbell with his evolutionary epistemology, because he actually modeled knowledge, right? It's evolutionary epistemology. It's and he uses the language of natural selection, right? There's a selection process, there's variation, there's mutation of ideas. So all of the inherent mechanisms of evolutionary theory, he applies them to epistemology. So for the viewers who might be interested in this, Donald Campbell, and actually you and I earlier mentioned something that people might not know when we discussed convergent validity. This also stems from Campbell and Fisk's a brilliant idea of the multi-trait, multi-method matrix, where when you're trying to validate whether a construct is truly doing what it's supposed to do, you have to kind of check off a whole bunch of validities. So Donald Campbell is truly an intellectual giant, and I guess many people... You would agree with that assessment, obviously.
Oh, yes, definitely. Well, then with regards to that multi-trait, multi-method matrix notion, that's a complicated one, because the notion is that you want to use separate measurement techniques to assess the same phenomena to see if you get the same report. And of course, the difficulty then is, how do you determine whether or not your measurement techniques are actually different? Because they can be technologically different, but embedded in the same theoretical framework. And so that makes their separateness of dubious validity. But I think that doesn't undermine the fundamental point. And I think the best example of that actually is the use of our senses to orient ourselves in the world. Because, well, sight obviously relies on the electromagnetic spectrum, and then audition relies on differential in air pressure, and then touch is well, that's actually the sense, the felt sense of the forces that are governing the external, the outside of molecules, which is what makes something solid. And then smell seems to be a direct assessment of the molecular structure of a substance. And so you can think of these as really they're using quite distinct channels to triangulate. It's actually quadrangulate, but to get a handle on the world. And the idea is, the more of your senses that a given phenomena activates simultaneously in a correlated manner, the more you can be certain that something actually is there. And then what the scientific method does is say, yeah, well, that's true for one person. But then if you take 10 people and you run them through the standard procedure and all 10 report the same thing, you can even be more certain that that thing exists. And so the multi-trait, multi-method approach to validation is actually a direct analog of what our senses do when we come into encounter with the world, especially when you also think about our senses as being extended by the capacity for communication and criticism. And so, which is also why it's so absurd to think about the scientific method as nothing but about the socio-cultural construct of phallogocentric oppressors, putting their jackboots on the throat of the world. The other thing that bothers me about that so much is that, there was a good article in the New York Times recently, but highlighting this. But, I worked for a UN panel for about 4 years, about 6 years ago, and it was devoted towards the idea of sustainability, which you could think about it as iterability, right? And it's a good rule of thumb for determining whether or not something is ethical. A game is ethical if you can play it over and over again without it degenerating. It's something like that. And that's actually what constitutes a good relationship. And so you could think about sustainability as that attempt to only engage in activities that you can repeat ad infinitum without degeneration. Now, it's more complex than that, but that's not a bad rule of thumb. Um, I really looked deeply into the environmental literature and also into the economic development literature. And one of the things that struck me, see, the original document that the UN had produced was a really 1980s Cold War document. The narrative hadn't been updated at all, and that was basically capitalism versus collectivism, with, of course, collectivism having the upper ethical hand, and the North versus the South. And I read that and I thought, guys, like, it's not 1985 anymore. Like, it's seriously not 1985. That's 50 years ago, and that isn't the world anymore. And so I was looking into economic development as such. Forget about inequality, but there is absolutely overwhelming evidence that we have been lifting people out of poverty, especially at the bottom end of the poverty distribution, at a rate in the last 15 years that is absolutely without parallel in human history. So, you know, the UN, for example, set its goal in 2000, one of its millennial goals was the halving of poverty by 2015, absolute poverty, which I think they had defined as subsiding on perhaps less than $1 a day. It was $1 or $1.50, something like that. They hit that by 2010. And we're knocking about 250,000 people a day out of that level of poverty and hooking about 300,000 people a day up to the electrical grid. And so this oppressive capitalism, which is in fact producing additional inequality, we've got to get that right, is eradicating poverty and misery at a rate that is just absolutely beyond comprehension. At this rate, within 50 years, the bottom end of the world will be middle class, just like it's happened in China, which is an absolute miracle, and like that's happening in India with absurd speed, and all through Southeast Asia, and increasingly in Africa, because the fastest growing economies in the world right now are in sub-Saharan Africa. And so the notion that there's something intrinsically oppressive about the Western viewpoint and about the manner in which we conduct ourselves and the way that we think, especially, let's say, from a scientific perspective, is the facts just demolish that argument. Now, inequality remains a problem. And also, one of the things that's happening is as the world becomes more and more connected, especially on the net, is that there is an increasing tendency for the winner to take all. You know, I mean, my Patreon account is a good example of that because it's been so fantastically successful. You know, I think there's 166,000 people on Patreon, and I think at the moment I'm something like number 6. And so the top 20 or 30 people, 50 people, 100 people, whatever it is, disproportionately take the benefits. And that's true for recording artists and for visual artists and for novelists and for scientists. And, you know, I got a letter from a fisherman the other day in Australia who he's a very smart guy, and he works in fishery policy, but he calculated a Pareto distribution for fishermen in Australia and found out that the rule applied there, and that in the top 1% of fishermen there was a Pareto distribution, so that the highest end of the top 1% were catching the most fish. And he said that what was interesting about that was that those guys, you could put them anywhere in the world in the ocean and they would catch fish. And not only that, but they were the ones that had the deepest understanding of the entire marine ecosystem. And so they were also the most interested in preserving the fish stocks, which I thought was extraordinarily interesting.
So this might interest you, since you mentioned winner-take-all markets. The economist who wrote the book titled "The Winner-Take-All Markets" or something to that effect is a gentleman who was a professor when I was at Cornell, Bob Frank, who was subsequently on my show. Now, he of course discusses the winner-take-all markets in a slightly different way, in that he argues that winner-take-all markets, by the very nature of the distribution, where very few people end up taking all the rewards, end up creating inefficiencies at the collective level. So, for example, there are millions and millions of people who wish to be the actor who's going to star in the next blockbuster. So they drop everything that they could otherwise pursue in their careers to head off to the land of dreams so that they could be that next guy. But the reality is, out of the 500,000 people who make that decision, one of them is going to get it, and 499,999 have potentially wasted their careers. So one of the difficulties with winner take all markets is that it creates these huge inefficiencies.
Oh, well, it's also, I think, one of the pathologies of creativity. One of the modern tropes is everyone's creative. It's like, that's wrong. Like, we looked at the Creative Achievement Questionnaire, which is a tool that I devised with one of my students, Shelley Carson, and another, Daniel Higgins. It's become a very frequently used measurement tool in the study of creative achievement. And the median score for creative achievement across 13 potential dimensions of creativity is 0. 60% of people score 0. And so 0 means I have no training or talent in this area. And the areas were, well, every area of creativity you could think of: scientific, literary, dance, architecture, invention, entrepreneurial ability. I can't remember the rest of them just offhand, but 0 is the median. Now you think, well, that's dreadful because creativity is an untrammeled psychological good. It's like, well, dispense with that idea, because it does exactly what you just described, is that creative people are engaged, as far as I can tell, in a high-risk, high-return strategy. And most of them fail. Now, the mitigating factor there is that among creative types, and this is often the case with entrepreneurs, is that the persistent creative types fail and 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 succeed.
Right.
And so, but they're also doing that in a Darwinian manner, because they have an idea and it looks like a good idea. But the danger is the market isn't ready for it, for example. The timing isn't right and the market isn't ready. People don't even know they have the problem. You don't know how to advertise and communicate about it. Someone might come out with a better product or a worse product that's better marketed and kill you. And so even if you've come up with a really good idea, that probably puts you 5% of the way to making economic success out of that idea. And I mean 5%, the reason I use that is because, like if you write a book, for example, I think you're lucky if you get 15% as the revenue stream. And so even if you've written a great book and you found a publisher and it's successful, the best you do is 15%. And so
that's why I'm thinking of going into self-publishing, by the way.
Yes, well, right. But you're also at the end of the Pareto distribution where you could make that work, right? So a 5% return is actually pretty good. And what corporate profits across any reasonable stretch of time don't exceed much. I think they're 8%, but 5% is not a bad estimate if you look worldwide. So 95% of your damn activity is mere self-maintenance, and the probability that you'll fail with a novel venture is unbelievably high. Right. So the problem with creativity is that it drives people to high return, high risk investments. And as you pointed out, then many of them end up failing. Now, that's mitigated again by the fact that just because you fail at one game doesn't necessarily mean that you'll fail at all of them. And there are multiple dimensions across which your life should be evaluated. But we should definitely dispense with the idea that A, everyone is creative, B, that everyone should be creative, and C, that's a good that has no downside. That's just, almost every idea is stupid and wrong.
So I want to share with you a theory that I had, or an application of a theory that's actually evolutionary based, which will hopefully lead to a segue for whatever time we have remaining to discuss some evolutionary ideas. So one of the reasons that a lot of the folks who we're talking about, the winner take all folks who decide that, hey, I could be a singer and I could be an actor, is that actually they are very poorly calibrated in terms of knowing whether they actually have the talent or not, right? And so I thought, when I used to watch the opening rounds of American Idol, that's the only time that I would ever watch it. The only reason I would watch it, the later rounds, I was completely uninterested. I found it grotesque and just really obnoxious. But what I loved, as a psychologist in the early stages, is the true, genuine surprise that people had when they would get up and their voices could kill all rhinos around the world. It's so bad. And yet they were genuinely surprised when the judges said, gee, you really, really suck, right? And they were genuinely, honestly surprised. And so I thought at one point, well, what could explain this miscalibration? And so this is where I brought out of my evolutionary toolbox the ideas of Robert Trivers, one of the most famous evolutionary biologists, where he talks about the evolution of self-deception. And so let me mention it to our viewers who may not be familiar with it. So Robert Trivers argued that, look, why is it that people have this uncanny ability to self-deceive? And he argued that it's an adaptive mechanism whereby when you and I are engaging in an interaction, ultimately, one of my intents might be to manipulate you in a Machiavellian sense. But this might send off little micro cues that I am trying to do that, which you're trying to pick up in me. Now, the way that I can ensure that you don't pick it up in me is if it shuts off in me. And the only way for me to do that is to believe the lie that I'm about to tell you. So it's really an evolutionary arms race in dyadic interactions, which ultimately leads to the evolution of self-deception. What do you think of that?
Oh, well, I actually wrote a whole unpublished book on self-deception because I've been so interested in it, Oh, cool. And I hope at some point to do something about it. But so let me make a couple of comments about that. Let's look at extroversion, for example. So if you're extroverted and emotionally stable, you're assertive and enthusiastic and gregarious, and people will tend towards considering you a leader because you'll take charge of a social situation. And then if you're low in neuroticism, you have very little fear. And so you appear dominant. There's other ways of being dominant, but that's one way. And one of the ways that people determine whether or not you know what you're doing is to see whether or not you're afraid when you make a claim. And if you're not afraid, then they assume that you're willing to act out the claim, and that's pretty good evidence that it's a decent claim. Now, it is by no means invariably true evidence, but it's like dominance it's like a dominance dispute in a primate pack, or in a lobster dispute for that matter. The guy whose nerve breaks first loses, and so he's seen as less true. Okay, so with the narcissism that you're seeing in those remarkable displays of talentless blindness, let's say, that seems to be a combination of extremely high extroversion and extremely low agreeableness. So very low empathy. And then I would also say, to really get a narcissist going, you also have to shelter them from any negative criticism for a good part of their life. Now, some people are just opaque to that, but if you spoil them, let's say, using a non-technical term, as children, and constantly praise them for everything they do and never call them to task, and they're extroverted and disagreeable, then you'll get a nice narcissist out of the deal. And I do agree, you rarely see better displays of narcissism than on those initial auditions. I have the opposite reaction to you, though, is I find those so painful I can hardly watch them, whereas I actually kind of like the triumphant ones later, So anyways, but this is more complicated, I think, than Trivers realized, and here's why. And I think this has to do with the winner-take-all phenomena. So let's say that you're extroverted and enthusiastic and low in negative emotion, and you have an idea. And the fact that you have those characteristics aggregates a group around you. And let's add to that the possibility that you're also intelligent, so you're attracting intelligent people. And then what you get is you start to get a loop of communicative feedback between a group of people who are actually capable of undertaking a fairly complex task. Now, the task itself is going to shift across time, because what the hell do you know to begin with? But that confidence might catalyze the formulation of a group that has enough ability and competence and flexibility to pursue success successfully across time, thereby validating your initial confidence, even though your confidence was not targeted towards the actual outcome. And you see this in entrepreneurial ventures, because one of the buzzwords that surrounds entrepreneurial success is the capacity to pivot. which means, well, you come out with an idea to begin with, and then you find out that, well, it's just not marketable. And you don't just give up and go home. You take your team and you aim at something else. So there's this peculiar set of circumstances that optimism can produce that's valid, even though objectively speaking, the initial optimism was unwarranted. Now, that doesn't mean that the same sort of thing can't cycle into absolute hell, because that's, I would say, an equiprobable outcome, or even a more improbable outcome. But you wouldn't have to be spectacularly successful that often from an evolutionary perspective, especially if you were male and could leave a tremendous number of descendants.
There you go, using transphobic systemic words like male. I'm offended.
Yeah, I know. And well, I just read one of those bloody abstracts that the new real peer review people
love those guys.
Oh, me too, man.
I'm addicted to those guys.
Yeah, I think they're doing a great service. I just read one that suggested that the entire category of men should be done away with, in the most condescending and reprehensible possible impossible.
I just posted yesterday I just shared a thesis, actually, since we're both Canadians. Maybe we could be proud of the following thesis. I think it was at Acadia University, where a master's student in education in the counseling subsection did a autoethnography of his sexual identity through interpretive dance. Now, this is the type of satire I used to come up with, but I didn't know that it was an actual thing that you could get a master's degree in interpretive dance, but apparently you can. And further,
yeah, well, education is one of those degenerate disciplines, right? I mean, it's had it. And
I hear you.
I like to say this as often as possible. The Ontario Institute for the Studies of Education is one of the most pathological institutions in Canada.
I've actually received certainly one very poignant email, if not several, from students who were finishing their teacher training and were heading off to this thing for a 1 year, whatever it is, and they were all just terrified to be placed in this hotbed of social justice warriors. It's extraordinary.
It is. I get a lot of letters like that,
exactly. Too. At some point, we need to put them together in one massive document to send them to the Canadian senators.
Yeah, well, one of the things I would like to do, and this might be something you would be interested in too, conceivably, is like I've got a lot of really interesting letters from people, and a lot of them are really thoughtful. Like some of them are just a few lines, but some of them are like 3 pages long and really thoughtful. And I would like to make an internet archive of those letters so that people could search it, because, I feel bad because I don't have time to respond to the letters or even to give them the attention that many of them truly deserve. But I think that as historical documentation of the times, that could be really useful.
100%, I'm on board. I mean, as you know, that my whole talk at the Manning Center was simply to read a bunch of these testimonies, right? That was my whole talk.
Right.
So exactly. Let's wrap up with whatever time we have left. Of course, I could sit here and talk to you for another 10 hours. You had recently on Martin Daly. Now, in case you don't know, let me. Some of my viewers know this, but you may not. So let me share it with you. I credit Martin Daly and Margot Wilson for having set me off on my scientific journey, because in my first semester as a doctoral student at Cornell University, I had taken an advanced social psychology course with a gentleman by the name of Professor Dennis Regan. And roughly halfway through the semester, he assigned the book Homicide. So this is in 1990, just as the sort of sub-discipline of evolutionary psychology was really coming together. And I read that book where they explain patterns of criminality using the evolutionary lens. It was so parsimonious, it was so powerful, that's how I had my eureka to then use evolutionary theory in studying consumer behavior, because I was interested specifically in studying consumer choice, consumer preferences, psychology of decision making, and hence that's how I eventually founded the field of evolutionary consumer behavior. So Martin Daly is my main man. So first, maybe you could tell us about your interaction. I haven't had a chance to watch him. Do you have a similar story? Usually most evolutionists have some similar epiphany story where they first got bitten by the evolutionary bug. Mine was Martin Daly and Margaret Wilson. Do you have a similar story? And maybe you could tell us about your interaction with them.
Well, it wasn't specifically with Daly, although one of the epiphanies that I had in relationship to his work is that I always knew that there was something wrong with the idea that poverty caused crime.
Right.
It's just a stupid idea, because there's lots of societies where the material level of comfort is vanishingly low, but that are perfectly functional. You know, like the pre-European contact Inuit were a good example of that. I mean, what did they own, man? They had snow and animal fat, and that was about it. You know, and so absolute level of privation is not an enticement to criminality. And as Nietzsche pointed out, you know, even dreadful life circumstances is no inevitable inducement to criminality, because you can interpret those dreadful circumstances in multiple ways, one of which is, I'm not going to continue promoting such things. Instead of, you know, if you're bullied, you can easily learn not to be a bully. And most people do, because otherwise the world would be nothing but bullies in about 3 generations, right? Because you'd get exponential increase in the prevalence of something that spread. It would instantly, everybody would be a bully, and that isn't what happens, so it gets dampened down. But what Daly really crystallized for me was the notion that it was economic inequality that was driving this behavior. Now, having said that, I've really been pulled in 2 directions about the ethical, what would you call it, the ethical ramifications of that discovery in 2 ways. One, we don't know what psychological factors mediate the relationship between inequality and homicide. Now, we do know that it mostly characterizes young men, mostly between the ages of 15 and about 26 or 27, and that it seems to have something to do with sexual competition. I buy that. But the mere fact that that's the case doesn't justify it. Like, it could be, the causal pathway could be perceived inequality, resentment and hatred among the more disagreeable and emotionally unstable subset of males in that unequal state, justification for violent behavior, right? In which case, you can't draw a straight causal pathway from the inequality to the homicide. And that the treatment could easily be, stop being miserable and jealous and go out and do something useful. Now, I'm not saying that that's the proper interpretation from an ethical perspective of the data, but it's a perfectly plausible interpretation. And so I think that one of the things that Daly does, and I was kind of disappointed in his last book in the last half because of this, is that he jumps from his data to the prescriptive notion that it's redistribution in a somewhat socialist manner that would best redress that. And the thing is, I would like to believe that, but I don't believe it. And I don't believe, or at least I'm skeptical of it for a variety of reasons. One is, well, we don't know how to redistribute. It's a big problem. And like, I've also watched people at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy suddenly come across money. And generally, it's a bloody catastrophe. It doesn't help them at all. You know, especially
lottery winners, right?
Well, that's a great example. But I mean, if you're dealing with people who are even in worse straits, like maybe they have an alcohol and cocaine problem, it's like, well, they're great as long as they're flat broke. But man, you give those guys money and you're lucky if they're not dead in a month.
Right.
You know, so merely providing people with money isn't as useful as socialists think. That's the problem with money, and that many of the problems that are associated with what the socialists consider poverty aren't problems of lack of money at all. So, and here's things the socialists do not like to take into consideration. And I would also say this is true of conservatives, by the way. Okay, first of all, there's a radically tight association between poverty and low IQ. And that doesn't mean every poor person is stupid, you know, to speak bluntly, but it does mean
you just brought 100,000 new haters to your
exactly.
email.
Well, exactly.
Good luck, Dr. Peterson.
Exactly. But the notion that if you're not intelligent, you're more likely to be poor is so self-evident that only someone who's willfully blind can deny it. or arrogant, you know. And I see this in the professoriate, who says, well, there's no evidence for IQ or for the biological foundation of IQ. So says the privileged person with an IQ biologically determined of 130 and above, who is sitting in his or her position precisely because of that radically unequal initial distribution of cognitive capacity. You know, so I just think that's so. What do? Attribute it to their own moral virtue? I mean, what kind of bloody argument is that? Conscientiousness matters, but even that seems to be heritable to a reasonable degree. Right. So there is no attempt to address the role of intelligence. Because look, God, here's something, man. This is mind-boggling, you know. It's absolutely mind-boggling. It is illegal in the United States to induct anyone into the armed forces who has an IQ of less than 83. Okay, now here's why, and this is really worth thinking about. So, you know, the U.S. Armed Forces has been doing intelligence research since like the beginning of the 20th century, really more than 100 years. And they've done a lot of the fundamental studies, and they were interested. And they were interested partly because, well, they wanted to actually select intelligent people for the officer corps, you know, good. But more importantly, as the social policies developed, in peacetime in particular, the armed forces in the U.S. has been used as a mechanism to move people from the chronic dispossessed underclass, let's say, up into at least the working class and maybe into the middle class. So it's an organization that can produce social mobility. And so they've been really interested in trying to find competent people in the dispossessed classes who have the intellectual capacity to rise up a few levels in the socioeconomic hierarchy, which, by the way, was also the reason that IQ tests were introduced and used in the UK. They were left-wing tools, not right-wing tools, just so everyone is clear about that. They were there to try to find the deserving, lower-class, uneducated who could benefit from higher cognitive training. And they worked, too. So anyways, the armed forces has been studying this like mad for a long time. And we need to point out that their motivations are precisely aligned, weirdly enough, with those of the more admirable socialist types, because they really do want to pull people out of the dispossessed class and move them up the economic hierarchy. There's no downside to that. All right, so what have they discovered? Well, they discovered painfully, after 100 years of contemplating it and trying to do everything possible to avoid the conclusion that if you had an IQ of 83 or less, there was not a single thing that you could possibly be trained to do in the armed forces, no matter what it was, that wasn't positively counterproductive. Now, 83, that's about 12% of the population. Now, you really got to think about that. That's 1 person in 8 who isn't sufficiently intellectually capable of performing the lowest end tasks in the military. Now, the military is complicated and it's becoming more and more complicated, so I'm not putting down the military. But what I am doing is noting that if that's true for the military, which has a huge range of possible disciplines and occupations, it's also true for standard society. And that means that 1 in 8 people in our society is now sufficiently intellectually impaired so that there is absolutely no place for them in the workforce. And redistribution of income is not going to help that. And that's just the surface. There's low IQ, even though average IQs are raising. But Jesus, man, if you can't run a computer now and you need to be pretty damn literate to do that, there's almost nothing you can do. And all the really low-level stuff, like, you know, in Toronto, there are guys who drive these little carts on the sidewalk to pick up garbage. Now, you could train someone with a lower IQ to use a stick with a point on the end of it to clean up garbage. And I'm not being a smartass about this. I've worked with low IQ people. I know how they struggle. I've had direct experience with them. And I know how much training it takes to get them to do even relatively simple tasks.
Good.
Okay, so we talked about IQ, and that knocks out about 10% of the population. And that's a lot of people. Okay, then there's unconscientious people, right? So maybe we take the people who are 1 in 20 low in conscientiousness. Okay, so that makes them not very well suited for rote jobs because you have to be reliable in a rote job, and definitely not suitable for things like managerial positions. Now, if you're extroverted and open and low in conscientiousness, maybe you can pursue a career as a stand-up comedian or an entertainer, something like that. That's an erratic lifestyle, but still functional, you know. But for standard jobs, low conscientiousness knocks you out. Then there's the top 5th percentile of people who are high in neuroticism. They can't tolerate stress. So they're going to come down with depression and anxiety disorders if you stress them at all. And those are independent dimensions. So that means we've got 5% on the neuroticism distribution, 5% on the conscientiousness distribution, and 10% on the IQ distribution. That means we've got 20% of the population who are going to struggle like mad, no matter what you do. And mere income redistribution is not going to help that. So I also understand that the inequality issue is a problem for social stability, because if inequality reaches its theoretical maximum, which it does when the winner takes all, then the rich end up in gated communities, which is a dismal and wretched way to live. And the entire society destabilizes because the murder rates start to climb up, and there's calls for revolution, and people turn to criminality as an alternative means of making money. It's a catastrophe. But the truth of the matter is that the classic political solutions to that, like simple economic redistribution, aren't sufficiently sophisticated to actually address the issue. So, like, I noticed this, for example. Here's an example of this. When I used to live in Alberta, I lived there at the height of the oil boom, and a lot of my young friends, because I was young at that point, 16, 17, quit school, went off and worked in oil rigs, and they were making like 70, 80 grand a year back in the late 70s. So they had more money than they knew what to do with. Okay, so what did they do with the money? Well, that was easy. They bought cars and wrecked them, and they went to the bars on the weekends when they came out of the oil rigs, for their 4 or 5 day break, and they spent like $1,000 a night till their money was almost completely blown. And 5 years later, the vast majority of them had absolutely nothing to show for it. Now, if you want to make money where oil is booming, what you do is go open a bar, because that's where all the money ends up, and so...
Or a brothel.
Well, or a brothel, that's right, or a strip joint or something like that. That's exactly right. That's where the money aggregates. But the socialist, part of the socialist issue, and I also think you could lay this at the feet of conservatives, capitalists, is that we think that money solves way more problems than it actually solves. And some of these damn problems are so intractable that there is no obvious way of solving them with money. I can give you an example with IQ. The Americans went to war on poverty in the 1960s, and they put the Head Start program into operation, right? And everyone was hoping for the Head Start program, man. Like, the socialists were hoping for it because it would raise the bottom and give everyone equality of opportunity. And the conservatives were hoping for it because, well, Jesus, if you could get the underperforming lower class educated and more productive, like, great. Who the hell is going to be against that? And I spent a lot of time scouring the Head Start literature, really, for like 10 years, because I wanted to understand it, because it was one of the most optimistic social programs that was ever produced in Western society. And here's the results. If you put kids in Head Start, say when they were 3 approximately, they leapt ahead of their peers, even cognitively. So they did better in school in grade 1 and grade 2 and grade 3. But by grade 4 and 5, all of their peers caught up. All of them. So they got an initial boost, but it didn't magnify the way it was hoped. Because you might think, you give kids an initial cognitive boost, and what that happens is that it increases exponentially across time and they stay ahead or even get farther ahead. Did not happen. Now, the Head Start kids were more likely to graduate. They were less likely to have teenage pregnancy, and they were less likely to be incarcerated. So it wasn't an abject failure, but the point was to improve cognitive function, which it did not do. It was an absolute failure at improving cognitive function. And that's a complete catastrophe. But it also shows you just exactly how intractable the problem is, because that was as good a program as a bureaucracy could implement. Now, it had flaws. Like, I calculated at one point how much additional adult attention the typical Head Start kid would get in a year from an adult. And the answer was virtually none, because you imagine that it's only about 2 hours a day. There's about 10 kids per adult. So then that's 2 hours divided by 10. Most of them are 3-year-olds, and so you don't spend most of your time interacting with 3-year-olds teaching them. You spend most of your time feeding them snacks and taking them to the bathroom and making sure they don't fight and taking off their winter clothes and all of that. And they also used Head Start as an employment program, so the people who were teaching the young kids weren't necessarily very qualified. So you could say that they really didn't receive any additional adult attention. But even that cynical view doesn't point in the direction of doing it better, because what are you going to do? Put them one-on-one with a trained adult? You know how bloody expensive that's going to be? It's just not going to happen. It's way too prohibitively expensive. So back to Martin Daly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that was a big parenthesis. That was a 20-minute parenthesis. All right, go.
Well, inequality is a problem, and it's a social destabilizing problem, and even Republicans and conservatives should be concerned about that, because it does destabilize society and it does increase the crime rate. But that doesn't mean we know what to do about it. We don't know what to do about it. And I don't think that we're willing to address the problem seriously, because we won't look at the actual causes of either poverty or relative inequality. We're too afraid to.
I want to ask you, I think, 3 more questions. 2 are somewhat personal. 1 to continue with the Martin Daly angle. So in my own work, I've looked at various areas where we could apply evolutionary theory to what would be considered clinical phenomena. So in several of my books, I talk about dark side consumption, things like compulsive buying and eating disorders and pathological gambling and pornographic addiction. All of these things are maladaptive manifestations. And so the argument is, well, why do they exist? Of course, the social constructivist arguments are always wrong. So, for example, eating disorders arise because of media images. Well, of course, that's so laughably incorrect, because you got Hippocrates, who documented the exact same epidemiology of eating disorders, more than 2,000 years ago. And so I look at some of the biological reasons and evolutionary reasons why these maladaptive manifestations would arise. I've also looked at things like OCD from an evolutionary perspective, Munchausen syndrome by proxy from an evolutionary perspective, suicide from an evolutionary perspective. So, and I'm not a clinician, and yet I can clearly see the fertile possibilities between marrying evolutionary principles and clinical phenomena. Now, why do you think that is, that too few clinicians, whether they be certainly psychiatrists and or clinical psychologists, have not turned to the explanatory power of evolutionary theory in helping them in their clinical work?
Well, I think they have in a more subtle manner. So, for example, if you look at people who study drug addiction, for example, I mean, the biology is just all over that.
Sure.
So for example, it is, and it has for 40 years, the question has not been, why do people take drugs? That is the wrong question. We absolutely know why people take psychoactive substances like psychomotor stimulants. So that's cocaine and amphetamines, let's say, but heroin fits into that category to some degree, although it's also an analgesic, so it reduces pain. We know why people take anti-anxiety agents. We're a little bit less clear about the psychedelics, because they're strange. They're a whole different kind of motivational category. And it's hard to get animals to take psychedelics. But the reason that people take psychoactive drugs like cocaine is because they directly activate the dopaminergic system, and that's the primary pleasure circuit. And so that's an evolutionary explanation. It's like you have an appetitive circuit. Most of the time it's after normal stimuli. There are super stimuli in the environment. Sugar is one. Gambling of certain sort is one. That's the random variable partial reinforcement schedules that slot machines use. Sexual stimuli are super stimuli, so that would account for pornography. The question isn't why people take drugs. It's why all people don't take drugs all the time. That's really the issue.
Because I'm high on life. I'm high on life, Jordan.
Well, look, but that is actually part of the answer, is that, like, if you take rats and you put them in a cage alone, you can get them to self-administer cocaine to the exclusion of all else, no problem. But if you put rats in a naturalistic rat environment, it's very difficult to get them to addict themselves to cocaine. And so part of the way that normal people, well-adapted people, avoid drug addiction is that they have better things to do. And that doesn't mean that those things are as exciting in the moment, but they balance the momentary excitement with the long-term cost and presume that, 60% of ecstasy of an ecstatic state for 20 years beats the hell out of 100% of an ecstatic state for 1 year, followed by, a catastrophic life on the streets. And people are pretty good at regulating themselves that way. So having something better to do, I think, is, well, it's a primary treatment modality for addicts. It's not only, and Carl Jung made very much of this years ago. He said, look, if you're treating someone who has a serious psychiatric disorder, let's say alcoholism, you cure the damn disorder, but all you do is leave the person with a massive hole in their life. All their friends were alcoholics. All their social life circulated around alcohol and other drugs. It's like, so they need to find something better to do than the drugs. That's also why I think this future authoring program works so well for young men. It's like, well, you need an adventure, and cocaine is definitely an adventure. But, maybe you could come up with one that's a bit more sustainable and a bit more heroic and a little bit less self-destructive. And so having a purpose for your life is actually one of the things that naturally activates the dopaminergic tracts and makes the demand for excess psychomotor stimulant activation recede. So I think the evolutionary ideas have saturated themselves into clinical practice more than you might think, especially among the sophisticated clinicians.
Well, that's good to